We are going to configure VLAN Trunking Protocol, also known as VTP. VTP allows for VLANs to be shared throughout a VTP domain. So here we are going to have a VTP domain, and it is going to be with these three switches down the middle. The two outer switches I'm going to leave outside of the domain for a specific reason, and I'll be showing you that once we go over the configurations. So as you can see, there is a VTP server, and then there are VTP clients. The server will be hosting all of the VLANs, and from there the clients will pull those VLANs through a trunk. So the first thing to do is to set up trunks between all the switches so that the VLANs can be propagated. Okay, so let's turn on these interfaces to make it a little bit easier for us to configure. Let's see. Always show port labels. Yes. Okay, here we go. So on the side, I'm going to put the 4 things that we need to set up VTP. That is VTP Domain, and then I'm going to choose Cisco to be the domain. We also need VTP password. Now, password isn't necessary in order for VTP domain to work, but if the VTP server has a password on it, then the client must have the same password as the VTP server. So in this case, we are going to use Cisco as well for our password. The VTP version we'll be using is version 2. And the last thing to set up is the VTP mode. And there are 3 different modes to configure. We have either VTP mode server, we have VTP mode client, and then we also have VTP mode transparent. Okay. Server and client are pretty straightforward, and transparent we are going to be configuring with this middle switch, and I'll show you what that does once we have it set up. So first things first, let's go ahead and set up all the trunk ports between our switches. We'll jump into our server switch right here. And our 3 ports are F01, F02, and F03. So let's go ahead and interface range F01 through 3. Because this is a multi-layer switch, we have the switch port mode, or actually switch port trunk encapsulation .1Q. That'll allow us to put switch port mode trunk on the interface. Switch port mode trunk. Now all those interfaces are trunks. They're going to turn amber and then turn green once they negotiate that with the other switches. Okay. Let's jump into each switch now and configure the trunk ports. For these layer 2 switches, we don't need to type switch port trunk encapsulation .1Q. We just need to interface and switch port mode trunk. This middle switch has 2 interfaces, interface F02 and F01. F01 is going to the bottom switch. Almost done. Last switch. And that is F03. There we go. So now all of our ports are trunk ports. So let's go ahead and establish our VTP server. First, let's go ahead and show VTP status. If I do a question mark, you'll see that the three different commands I could use are counters, password, and status. Status is the one that's going to show us all the configurations we would like to see. So here we go. We did show VTP status right here. It shows the versions that it's capable of using, the version that is currently being used, the domain, which is not set yet, and what we are concerned with, the mode, and the existing VLANs, also revisions. We haven't made any changes to our VLANs, so there are no revisions yet. If I were to add a VLAN, this would go up by one. If I take a VLAN out, it would go up by another one. And the existing VLANs is 5 because of the 5 default VLANs that are on there already. Now it doesn't show you a VTP password, but once you configure it, it'll show when you do VTP status. So let's go ahead and configure our VTP server. I'm going to go to global, VTP Domain, Cisco. Says changing VTP domain name from null to Cisco. VTP password, Cisco. Setting device VLAN database password to Cisco. VTP version, although it's already set to 2, we'll just make sure, configure VTP version 2, and then even though it's already set to server, we will also just make sure and configure VTP mode server. Okay, and it says of course device mode already VTP server. So let's now show VTP status again, and we see that there is version 2, there is the domain name Cisco, there is the operating mode server, and it doesn't show VTP password. Let's see, show VTP password. There we go. Show VTP password Cisco. Doesn't show in the show run. That's okay. So we can do show VTP password to see our password. Okay. So now let's go ahead and configure our 2 other switches that are in our VTP domain. VTP domain Cisco, VTP password Cisco. Note that password and domain has to match the server. VTP version 2, and I always set the VTP mode last, because if I set it to VTP mode client first, it won't let me change the domain or password. So because it's in client mode right now, if I type VTP domain and then I put null, oh, well, it does let me change the domain, but I believe it won't let me change, I believe I'm not allowed to create VLANs. Right, it's VTP VLAN configuration not allowed when device is in client mode. Okay. Well, VTP domain is Cisco. Okay. Okay, so let's show VTP stat. And here we go. We see version 2. Configuration revision, because I just created number of existing VLANs 5. VTP operating mode client, domain name Cisco. Okay. So now let's go to our 3rd switch in the domain. VTP Domain Cisco. Domain name has already set to Cisco. That's interesting. Let's show VTP stat. And it already picked up the domain name, although it is in server. And the version is 2. But what about the password? Did it pick up the password? Show VTP password. No, it did not pick up a password. Even though the domain name was propagated, the password wasn't. And of course, without that password, it's not going to work correctly. So first, let's go ahead and set the password and then change it into a client, not a server. So let's go back to global, VTP password, Cisco. Okay, good. VTP, let's just go through the configurations, VTP version 2, and then VTP mode client. Show VTP stat. Now it is in client mode. Cisco for the domain, version 2, revisions 3. So remember, the server had revisions of 0 when we first looked at it. And now we see revisions 3. There have been 3 revisions to this domain. That's interesting. Okay. Now, these 2 switches hanging off the side are also trunked to the server. And I have them shown as VTP clients, but we're going to configure these a little differently. I'm going to make this one in a different domain. Okay, so VTP domain, and let's see, what should this domain be? Domain, let's just make something up. Let's just do Jupiter. Jupiter. If I could spell Jupiter, here we go. Jupiter. Okay, now let's go on. VTP password, Cisco, VTP, and you see that mismatch that's already showing up. VTP version 2, VTP mode client. And that's dynamic trunking protocol domain mismatch, unable to perform trunk negotiation on port F01 because of VTP domain mismatch. And that error keeps popping up on F01. Well, now let's go ahead and look at the show IP interface brief, and let's look at F01. F01 is still up. So there's still a trunk between the two. The lights are still green, it's still trunked, but we're just going to error that there is a VTP domain mismatch. It's not in the domain. And then, okay, on this one, we are going to put in the domain, but we are going to configure the password to be incorrect. Okay, configure VTP domain. It should already be Cisco since it's trunked and the other one picked it up. Domain Cisco. Already set to Cisco, yes, because of the trunk. VTP password. This time we'll put Jupiter for the password. Okay, VTP version 2. VTP mode client. Okay, perfect. And what I'm expecting is for these 2 outer switches to not receive the VLANs that we're going to configure on the VTP server because of the misconfigurations, because this is in the wrong domain and because this has the wrong password. Well, these 3 in the middle, these 3 should be sharing all the VLANs once the server configures them, and then we will go ahead and show how we can configure a VTP transparent switch. Okay, and what happens afterward. So let's go back into the server. First, let's show VLAN brief. Let's look at all of our VLANs, and we have VLAN 1, our default, and then the other 4 default VLANs, 1002, 3, and 4, and 5. Let's go ahead and configure a good amount of VLANs. Let's do VLAN 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Okay. Show VLAN brief. Great. Okay, show VLAN brief. I do that too often. Okay. Now we can see 2 through 9 in our database. Great. Being configured on the server. Now, because these are clients, they're not allowed to configure VLANs in their database. Well, let's go ahead and take a look. Also, let's show VLAN status. VTP status. Show VTP stat. And here you can see 13 existing VLANs and 11 revisions. Okay. Show VLAN brief. Now this is the middle switch. And there we go. You see VLANs 2 through 9 automatically existing in the database. Because of VTP, it pulled all of its VLANs from the VTP server. Show VTP stat, and we should see 13 existing VLANs and 11 revisions to this VTP domain. Wonderful. And for this guy, we should expect to see all the VLANs. Wonderful. 2 through 9. And show VTP stat, and we should also see 13 existing VLANs and 11 revisions. Now for these guys, we should not see those VLANs. This is on a different domain. This has the wrong password. So let's go ahead and look at the left switch. And of course, he's getting this error, all these domain mismatches. Show VLAN brief. And those VLANs do not exist. Show VTP stat. I only have 5 VLANs, and there's only been 1 revision. So this switch is not in the domain, and it's not pulling those VLANs from the server. Now this one on the right side has a wrong password, so let's go ahead and show VLAN brief. And he also does not have those VLANs. Show VTP stat. Even though he is within the domain, he does not have the password for the VTP server. So he does not have access to those VLANs. Only 5 existing VLANs, only 1 revision. So both the password and the domain must match. Okay. Not each other, they must match the server's password and domain. Now let's go ahead and look at one other mode, transparent. Okay. And let's go ahead and set the middle switch to transparent, and let's see what happens then. So let's go ahead, go to global, VTP mode transparent. Setting device to VTP transparent mode. Show VTP stat, and you'll see that this is in transparent. Okay. So now the middle switch is transparent. The bottom switch is still a client. So that being transparent means that this switch is not going to participate in VTP. The VLANs still exist on this switch that it received, and so those VLANs will still trunk through, and you could still attach to those VLANs through other ports, but from this point forward, it will no longer participate in VTP. So if any more VLANs are created, it will not receive those VLANs. Well, now how does that affect our bottom switch since this switch is in the middle? And that's what we want to find out. Okay, so VTP Server. And let's go ahead and create VLAN 40, 50, and 60. Okay. Show VLAN brief. We now see VLAN 40, 50, and 60. Let's go to the transparent switch. Show VLAN brief. We don't see 40, 50, 60 because it is not using VTP to pull those VLANs. 2 through 9 exist still because those were already pulled before we turned it to transparent. But what about this switch? Does it still pull from the server even though another switch in the middle is transparent? Let's show VLAN brief. And yes, it does. It pulls 40, 50, and 60. Even though this switch is transparent and in between the server and the client will still pull VLANs from the server because these two links between the two are still trunks. They're still trunks, and so the VTP client is still trunked to the server. It's just this switch in the middle is pretty much invisible to their domain, right? It's transparent. So the VTP client is going to see a trunk link to the server as like directly connected, as if that switch isn't there. Either way, this is how you configure VTP, and this is how you're able to propagate VLANs throughout a VTP domain.